This is session number 3 of Course 1 on how to study the Bible. In this session, as we think about observation and interpretation, we want to predominantly think about the literary context as we explore the specific genre of the Old Testament narratives. As we explore this type of literary style or genre, our main concern isn't going to be on the argument of the book so much as the development of the plot. Last session we talked about looking at paragraphs and epistles, but our concern here is the plot of the narrative. When we think about the historical context, we're going to be thinking of that more in a supplemental sense in this presentation and even as we do the workshop next week. When you come across specific references to location, we are certainly going to be thinking about the geography, or we might need to investigate cultural behaviors like we illustrated last time with Abraham and hospitality in Genesis 18, and ideological beliefs that may need to be ferreted out as we do our observation and interpretation. Let's talk about what is a narrative. Narratives are simply stories. They're purposeful stories. They retell historical events of the past to give us meaning and direction for our own lives in the present. Narratives in the Old Testament are really from Genesis to Esther, and then there are some narratives in Jeremiah, in the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and the book of Jonah. But when we think about narratives, there are various levels that we need to consider. The first level is the grand story of the Bible, the storyline from Genesis to Revelation, starting with the story of God covenanting with Abraham and then redeeming the people out of Egypt, them entering into the land, being exiled and then partially returning, then a period of 400 years of silence between the Old and the New Testament, then Jesus coming to earth, dying in our stead, the church forming, and then Jesus coming back, consummating the ages in the end. This is a basic storyline of the Bible, and your role as the Bible student is to know where the particular story that you're studying, where does it fit into the storyline, and also how does it contribute to the storyline. So this is the first level. The second level is the narrative of the book you're studying itself. As you carefully read and study a book like Genesis or Judges, you want to trace that story, having one of its own. So if we were to look at Genesis, we would want to think about how does the creation and the fall of humanity provide a foundation for the story of the patriarchs. Or we could say that Genesis 1 to 11 explains for us how we get from creation to Abraham himself. So when we look at the storyline of the book, you want to think about how does the plot unfold in the book. You don't want to just think about individual stories separate, but how they fit together. And Genesis beautifully illustrates that point. Then moving down to a narrower focus, the particular unit or the chapter that has a narrative in it that you're studying. So if we're thinking a little closer, we notice that the story of Joseph actually falls under the story of Jacob. But then you'll see I have illustrated the first several narratives in the Joseph story, how they are in units like that and how they fit together and then how the plot is developed. So you want to think about how the individual narratives contribute to the entire storyline of the book. Those are the various levels that you want to consider. Well, let me just give you another example. Let's think about Joshua chapter 1 through 5. The connection to the grand story is found at the very beginning of the book as it connects us to where we leave off, where it's left off in Deuteronomy when Moses has passed away and Joshua takes his place. Now as you read through the book of Joshua, you'll come to the point of understanding that you really need to know what was written in Deuteronomy, because much of what Moses says in Deuteronomy has great bearing on what happens in Joshua, as well as the subsequent books, the meaning, and that's kind of like the whole grid. We could also say that connecting the story of Joshua to Genesis chapter 9, where Noah actually curses Canaan, the son of Ham, now that curse comes to fruition in this story in the book of Joshua. So that would be some examples of how we would connect it to the grand story. Now, thinking about just the first 5 chapters, again, we'd want to think about these first 5 chapters as they really ready us for Israel entering into the land, or I should say readying Israel for entering in the land, and how that piece would fit with the rest of the narrative. But then the contribution of the individual narratives, we notice that God brings a charge or a commission to Joshua to not be afraid, to be strong and courageous, because the Lord is going to go with him. And we also would want to talk about in chapter 2 of how God actually brings confirmation that indeed the land is being given to Israel as the 2 spies go to Jericho, and how the incident confirms to them that indeed the land has been given to them by the Lord. It's interesting to notice the contrast between this story and the story we have in Numbers, in 13 and 14 of Numbers, where the 12 spies were sent and the failure to enter the land in disobedience. Another piece, of course, you're going to notice in chapter 2 that will be developed more in chapter 6 is the whole part, the role that Rahab plays as she is rescued from God's judgment, she and her family, and the whole theological piece of consideration and the gospel that plays out with that. We could also talk about the crossing of the Jordan in chapters 3 and 4. That in this incident confirms Joshua's leadership to the people. And then there is the preparation of the people before they take the first city of Jericho, as the rite of circumcision takes place, as well as the people observing and participating in the Passover. All right. So now that we have looked at the narratives and the levels, we want to begin to think about what are the critical pieces of the narrative that I need to consider when I'm interacting with it. Might I just add that you want to just really jump right in there and become a part of the story itself. And some of these guidelines, I think, will help you do just that. The first thing you want to think about is the characters. The characters. The characters have particular roles to play. The protagonist is the primary person in the story. That's your main character. The one opposite to them is the antagonist, the person who is in conflict, the one who's going to create tension and some drama in the story. Now, thinking again of the grand story, we would say that the protagonist is God himself, and the antagonist is Satan. There are other characters, however, called agonists. They are also important characters that play a role and have a critical part in the story. Going again to the large picture, God's people would be the agonist in the story. Now, thinking more of immediate stories, more immediate characters, the protagonists and antagonists could be people like Jacob and Esau, or David and Saul would be examples of the protagonist and agonist relationship, antagonist relationship. So those are some things that you want to keep in mind. And basically, when you're looking at your characters, you want to keep your eye on what is going to happen to the protagonist. That's going to be critical. What happens to that individual as the story unfolds? As we think about characters, we want to look for the character's actions and words. Many times the narrator is not going to give specific descriptions of what kind of person they are. They're not going to say explicitly that this is a good person or a bad person. What you want to look at is the actions and words of a character. Of course, you and I know that from the experience of life, right? It's by a person's words and actions that we begin to learn the character. And the same plays out in narrative. For instance, when we think about Jacob as a schemer, how do we come to that conclusion? Well, when we see in chapter 26 And in chapter 27 of Genesis, we see how he cheats Esau out of the birthright and the blessing. How about Ruth? She turns out to be a very courageous woman and a gregarious woman. How do we know that? It's not because the narrator explicitly tells us that, but rather it's the actions that we see. We see her courage by saying to Naomi, your people will be my people. I'm going to stay with you. And the fact that she goes out into the fields and works hard shows the gregarious nature of this woman. We could talk about faith with and expediency with Abraham by his actions. We see that he leaves the land of Ur and goes to a place he doesn't even know where he's going to end up, trusting God, and yet in the next breath we notice him lying about who Sarah really is in relationship to him. And yet we see him also doing things like taking matters into his own hands with Hagar and having a son with her. But then we notice that he does the great heroic act of willing to offer his son, which shows the greatest sign of faith. My point is, it's the actions as you see the character play out that tells us a lot about the character that's being described. Also, characters can appear in contrast or in parallel to each other. Let's talk about the contrast in a couple different ways. First, we could talk about the contrast just as the characters interact with each other and how one is pitted against the other. This is particularly clear in the story of Joseph. Joseph versus his brothers. You notice that right away in chapter 37 when Joseph talks about his dreams and the brothers' response to that, or when Joseph comes out to meet them and they're plotting to get rid of him. We could talk about it as well in chapters 42 through 47, how Joseph puts them through a ringer of sorts of tests, how they respond to that. It's Joseph against his brothers. Even when his father passes away in chapter 50 and how the brothers gather together versus Joseph. There is this contrast between Joseph and the brothers that is being played. But there also is another type of contrast where it might be independent of each other and yet to see the contrast taking place. This is particularly evident when we come to Genesis chapter 38 versus chapter 39. At first it seems a bit odd because the story of Joseph takes place in chapter 37, but all of a sudden you have this strange story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38. That perplexed me for many years, but then all of a sudden when you see the contrast that takes place with Joseph with an entirely separate situation in chapter 39, you see why the narrator, why the author has done this. Let me just show how this is so. In chapter 38, we find that Judah marries a Canaanite woman. Now, if you've been familiar with Genesis and you're reading through Genesis, you find that this is forbidden. That's why we notice, for instance, why Abraham sent his servant Eliezer back to his homeland because he didn't want Isaac to have a Canaanite woman. Or the fact that Esau married a Canaanite woman as an affront and offense to his parents shows that that was an offensive thing. So the fact that Judah does that shows us something about his character. The fact that he refuses to actually do what was lawful and rightful for his daughter-in-law Tamar to marry the third son after the first sons died because of their wickedness shows again his selfishness and being more interested in himself. Again, notice the actions here tell us the kind of person he is. And then we find that he sleeps with someone whom he presumes to be a prostitute. Therefore, he is a very immoral person. Now notice this description of Judah versus his brother Joseph in chapter 39. Potiphar wants Joseph to sleep with her, but he refuses to do that. Why? Because it would be a wicked and sinful thing against God. So we learn that Joseph is a very God-fearing man, and because of that, he refuses to do so. And he doesn't cave in either, does he? She persists day in and day out, and yet he refuses to concede to that immoral behavior. So you notice there's a contrast between the two brothers as we take these two chapters and see them side by side. It's also interesting when we notice the way that Joseph handles his brother in chapters 42 through 45. And then it's interesting to see the change in Judah when in these very same chapters, again by his actions and his words tell us that he is a different man. So sometimes a narrative will actually then take and want you to see two characters and the way they respond to show the opposite, responding opposite to a similar temptation or situation or pressure, and it's being highlighted for us. Uh, Even in the Gospels, I think of the story of Mary as she pours out the nard with Jesus versus Judas and his jealousy. We notice a contrast of characters there, even in the Gospel. The same type of thing is being played out. Characters also have a parallel aspect, and again, speaking of the New Testament and the Gospels, we see how this is played out in the birth narratives of Luke chapter 1 and 2. John the Baptist parallels the Old Testament figure Elijah, in the fact that the role he plays is similar. Mary, likewise, with Hannah. Mary actually quotes the prayer of Hannah in Luke chapter 2 from 1 Samuel chapter 2. When you're looking at characters, and this part admittedly actually segues into the second part as we think of narratives, but I placed it here because I thought it fits well with the characters. The dialogue has a critical part. If we talk about now the actions and the words, then the dialogue then is going to be a key part for us to consider. So when you're getting to the opening of a particular narrative, such as a narrative of Joseph, that can often provide clues to the plot of the story as well as the characterization of the speaker himself. So the first words of Joseph in chapter 37 of Genesis indicate that he was at best a naive boy, or at worst very arrogant, a spoiled brat as he flaunts his dreams. It was not a very wise thing for him to do. So we learn a little bit about him in that opening scene. And his brothers, they challenge it, will you actually rule over us? And that gives us a hint now to the plot. That gives us an idea that this is going to be, how is this going to play out? That obviously these dreams and their reaction to it is the challenge of sort that plays out for us. And we see that that actually gets resolved at the very end, where indeed they do bow down before him, and so that the fruition of the dreams becomes a reality in the land of Egypt. When we think about dialogue, we need to think again about the contrast of dialogue. Let me illustrate again with Genesis 39. There is an incredible dialogue contrast between what Joseph says versus what Potiphar's wife says, right? We learn something about them by what they say in the dialogue and how Joseph reacts to it. We could also talk about what Judas speaks of in chapter 44 versus what Joseph says in chapter 45. When we talk about dialogue, we also should see that the narrator emphasizes crucial parts sometimes by one character repeating or summarizing a piece of the narrative in his or her speech. Once again, the story of Joseph illustrates this. In chapter 42, when the brothers realize that they are being caught for their previous sins, we find them conversing together the scenario, the narrative that happened back in back in chapter 37. They're rehearsing that piece of the narrative for us. The same happens a little bit later when Judah is actually trying to plead for the case for his brother Benjamin, and he rehearses much again the narrative. And you're going to find this in different places. Another place that comes to my mind in Genesis actually is the story of Eliezer going to get a wife for Isaac. You find repetition there as well in the narrative, and sometimes it seems laborious, but you really should pay attention to that because the author wants to point something out very important to you, and you don't want to lose sight of that reality. Let's talk about the second part. We've talked about the characters, and the whole piece on dialogue really segues into the plot piece. And in a sense, we have talked a lot about the plot already in this presentation, but let me give a formal definition for you. The plot is simply an intentional and coherent arrangement of events. That's why I say looking at the various events in the specific chapters is you don't want to just see the stories isolated by themselves, but how they build and how they develop the plot as a whole. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there is an end. There is also specific types of conflict that are portrayed in plots. Often in the Bible, you have physical adversity and danger. I'm reminded of David when he's fleeing from King Saul. We see a lot of physical danger being presented in 1 Samuel. Then you have conflict of character. We could talk about Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, or Esau and Jacob, or Elijah and Jezebel in 1 Kings. Related to that can often be a moral or spiritual conflict. Certainly, Cain and Abel is a story really of good versus evil, or the seed of the woman versus the seed of the serpent. When we think about the plot and the grand narrative of the biblical story, we see that God has created man in his image and likeness to have a close personal relationship with him, which has a specific mission to fulfill. But then the antagonist, Satan, comes in and brings about the fall of man, and so that the relationship is broken. And so the whole plot that unfolds from Genesis 4 and onwards, or from Genesis 3 and onward, is how indeed the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. How is that going to play out? How does the whole line of redemption occur? That's the main plot. And of course, it's resolved when Jesus comes and dies on our behalf, and when he comes again and brings the fullness of the kingdom in his second return. That, in a nutshell, is what the biblical story plot is. So we've talked about it being a plot having a beginning, middle, and end, but we notice that as the plot unfolds, there is tension that builds, and you want to pay attention to that tension as you read through and interact with a biblical narrative. We also want to talk about simple plots. The Genesis 38 is a very simple plot between Judah and Tamar. But the complex plot would be the whole unfolding of the story of Joseph and the reason why the brothers sell Joseph in the first place, and that's to get them to Israel, to Egypt. And it really prepares us for, in the larger narrative, to the story of Exodus. We could actually back up and say that God told Abraham way back in chapter 15 that they would be in a foreign land. And this story, the story of Joseph, tells us how they actually end up in that foreign land in Egypt. The third part is the plot resolution. The plot resolution. In the ultimate story, the plot resolution is just what I've described a minute ago, how God rescues mankind from the enemy's clutches through his son Jesus, and then the final restoration of the new heaven and the new earth that's specifically described for us in Revelation. The narrative of Genesis, the resolution, we would say, is actually Joseph and his family, after so many years, being reunited in Egypt, and that's where we leave them, in Egypt, which of course segues us to the next piece of drama in the book of Exodus. When we think about plots, we should also think about the specific scenes. A scene is the action being moved along actually by a series of scenes, and I want to illustrate that for you when we come to Genesis 37. The opening scene would be Joseph giving a bad report on his brothers. But then we learn that he is a favorite of Jacob, and that is the cause of the hatred of the brothers toward Joseph in verses 3 through 4. Then immediately the next thing we notice is these two dreams in the next two scenes, the two dreams that Joseph tells, which just creates greater animosity toward him. And then it's kind of like the pause button in verses 12 through 17, as Jacob desires for Joseph to go check on his brothers, and so Joseph goes and searches for them, and that builds the tension and the preparation for what happens next, which is the plot to kill them. And then by the brothers, that is, and Reuben, he wants to stop all this. He wants to intervene and rescue and bring him back to his father because he's the firstborn. But that doesn't happen, does it? Because Judah, well, for some reason, Reuben is not around, and Judah comes up with this ingenious plan as he sees the Midianites on the horizon. Hey, let's sell them off instead of kill them. And of course, that's what happens. And so when Reuben comes back, there's great grief, realizing that his plan that he was hoping to take care of this situation has all been for naught and will not work, and it's been stopped. And of course, the incredible grief of the father Jacob when they bring the coat with allegedly that he has been killed by an animal, a wild animal. So paying attention to the specific scenes in a given narrative helps you see how the action moves along, and it's an important piece to remember. We should also talk about the narrator and the role that the narrator plays in the narratives. He really is the person who's kind of omniscient. He knows everything about the story, and his responsibility is to draw you in, to be a participant for yourself, to see things for yourself, and to come to conclusions based on what he wants you to see. He really is the one who presents God's point of view. God's point of view. Occasionally, he's going to do this explicitly. Let me illustrate it from Genesis 39. We notice in that chapter the repeated refrain, "The Lord was with Joseph." You'll see that in the underlining there several times, which means that he wants us to see it from God's point of view, that God was doing something far beyond what appeared on the surface. But he also can bring about God's point of view through the lips of the character himself. And this, again, happens with Joseph. We learn that what God was doing is summarized in this verse in chapter 50. You intended to harm me, right? They sold him off. They wanted to get rid of him. It was a great evil they did. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. That tells us God's point of view, that God indeed was working in that. And so paying attention to that piece of God's point of view is incredibly important. Another thing we need to talk about are the features of structure. You want to pay attention to repetition. Repetition can happen with key words. For instance, in Genesis 37, the word brother occurs 15 times. And the word hated occurs 3 times. In other words, the repetition of those words are something that we want to pay attention to because they bring about a theme, and they bring about effect of what is taking place. The fact that they were brothers and yet such hatred was happening is something that we would want to notate. With repetition, we also need to talk about resuming. The story of Joseph begins in chapter 37, but then there is this break that happens in chapter 38, and then it resumes in chapter 39. So that the last words in chapter 37 and the first words of chapter 39, if you notate, you will see that they are very similar because the author wants you to pick up where we left off, even though we had this detour or break in the middle. You can also have stereotyped patterns. This is particularly evident in books like the Book of Judges, where you will see how it begins and ends, where it talks about, and the people again rebelled and turned, forgot God and turned to their own thing, and how God oppressed them, and then how God delivered them. You'll see those repeated patterns. You'll also notice it in places like 1st and 2nd Kings, talking repeated refrain about how they did not turn away from the sins of Jeroboam. So those are features that you want to pay attention to as you read and interact with the narrative. You also have what we call the structure or the feature of inclusion. In other words, the narrative begins and it closes with the same note. So thinking about the story of Joseph, it opens with the theme of the brothers bowing down, and it closes with the brothers bowing down. So it starts with the theme, with the dreams that this is going to happen, and we see that indeed it does happen by the time we come to the close of the narrative. In the sense, it's kind of like an envelope effect. You also have a feature we call a chiasm, and you'll see it's an ABCBA. So you'll see that the parallel between the A narratives and the B narratives, with the C being in the center. Sometimes that happens with literature in the Bible and even with narratives. Foreshadowing is something that is briefly noted earlier in the story that is picked up later on in later detail. the births of Perez and Zerah, as mentioned in chapter 38, verses 27 through 30. That would be Tamar's sons. And they are actually mentioned because it will be mentioned again in the genealogy of Genesis chapter 46. And Perez takes a particular important role as the firstborn, which is a key piece to the story of the Old Testament. We should also talk about God's involvement in the narrative. This becomes critically important because we want to constantly ask ourselves, what does this teach me about God? What does it teach me about his ways as he's relating to his people? Let me highlight this for you in the story of Joseph. The Lord was present with Joseph, right? The Lord never forgot Joseph. We notice that the interpretation of dreams, that the function that Joseph has in this narrative, is not because of his own ingenuity and skill, rather it is because of God himself. We also notice that God sent Joseph ahead to preserve the remnant and to save many lives by a great deliverance. And it was something that God intended for good. And then speaking of the future, going back to the land of Canaan, Joseph says, God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land, which is going to connect us with the Exodus story all the way to the story in Joshua. So now we need to talk about application. When we think about the observation, we're thinking again about the particular details and how it is resolved. But we need then to identify what are the key themes and the main points of the story to be our interpretation. As we said before, that all serves as the foundation now for our application. From our interpretation, we get the general principles that we need to think about. And when we talk about the general principles, which is that bridge section between the two worlds, we need to really think of two things, two levels of application, or two levels of general principles to discuss. First, we must talk about, identify the issues of faith or ethics or decisions and choices that are made, or they're wise or evil, that help us to ferret it out for our own lives. Let's look at how this plays out with the story of Joseph. We could talk about the danger of jealousy and hatred and what that can, the damage that can cause. The importance of forgiveness and how to confront sin in a way that is wise and prudent, between the testing that Joseph puts the brothers through. We could talk about Joseph's moral example of steadfast under temptation and fleeing from it in the hour of danger. We certainly would discuss God's sovereignty in our suffering as we see it played out through the story of Joseph. We could talk about Joseph's role in society, as he has a key role to help not just the Egyptians, but the entire ancient world in a time of great crisis for the betterment of society. And discuss the opportunity to change, that the brothers had a chance to repent and to turn. And we see this particularly with Judah himself in the character change that happens in the narrative. Those are all basic themes we can discuss, issues of faith that we can discuss, and then look at those lists and then consider the specific issues in our own lives that the story challenges us, that we've identified, and that how it would be applied. So getting down to the nitty-gritty in our own lives and considering that, just as we talked about with the epistles. Now that's the first level. The second level is, how does the story point to Christ? This is incredibly important. We don't want to simply moralize the story. We want to consider the themes and the patterns that are in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, how those themes are developed. We know that God's grace and mercy throughout the entirety of the Old Testament is seen if we look at it with great care. For instance, as when we look at the story of Genesis, we certainly can trace God's grace to humanity as he saves Noah from judgment in the flood, or as he takes the initiative to break into Abraham's life and make a covenant with him. Another thing, in addition to themes, is to look at persons and certain roles that they play, particularly in certain roles of salvation for others, just as Jesus has done. And I want to illustrate this to you with the story of Joseph. We find that Joseph was rejected by his own and sold for silver. Jesus also was rejected by his own and sold for silver by Judas. Joseph was taken to a land of exile. Wasn't Jesus taken to a land of exile from his own home into this earth? Joseph was unjustly accused. Jesus was unjustly accused. Joseph actually was used to deliver the remnant, to preserve the remnant from the threat of famine, but not just the remnant, all the peoples of the land of the ancient world at that time. And so has the Lord Jesus come to save his people, his own people, Israel, from their sins, but also not only the Israel, but all peoples, including non-Jews, we call Gentiles. So seeing the application in this fashion is incredibly important as we see how does the story point to God's salvation through Jesus, and how I'm covered under that is incredibly important to constantly come back to the gospel and see how the Old Testament story points us in that direction. So that's my presentation, and here is the assignment for our workshop next week. I want you to read and interact with Exodus chapter 1 through 15. As you do so, identify and describe the main characters. I want you to demonstrate how their actions and words tell you what kind of person they are, and to think about the role they play in the narrative. Then I want you to trace the development of the plot in these chapters. Talk about how you see the tension increasing. How do you see the plot resolved by chapter 15? What clues do you pick up from the dialogue between the two main characters that help you determine the plot? Then see how the story of Exodus actually connects to the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the book of Genesis. Give specific verses and statements that show you that connection. And how important is the story of the Exodus in the whole storyline of the Old Testament? Again, you need to support your answers with specific concepts and/or verses from the text of Exodus itself. Identify the theological concepts in the story that provide guidance for us today. And also to think about how the story points itself to Jesus and to Christianity beyond itself.